Arc Raiders is a really good game. Probably. I mean, I've never actually played it. I didn't even get into the technical test back in May. My one and only experience with the game came from the 2-day server slam last weekend, and I'm willing to bet I'm not alone in that. This game has been building up a lot of hype, and this event was the first time everyone's been able to get their hands on it, no begging for keys required, and as a result, it's carrying a lot of weight. Sure, it was only 2 days, but they were the first 2 days for many people, and first impressions are important. They set the tone for the entire experience, and in this case, that experience extends far beyond the borders of Arc Raiders itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's take a couple steps back and talk about what Arc Raiders even is. You've probably gathered that it's a shooter from all the people shooting guns that I've shown so far, with a third-person camera and plenty of robotic enemies to serve as target practice / lessons in hubris. But even more important than that time-honored tradition of exchanging bullets is what I'm doing in the background right now. Namely, leaving. Extracting, to use the proper terminology, is basically the point of the whole genre, and fittingly makes up a full 50% of the title, Extraction Shooter. These experiences are based all around the 3 Gs: get in, get stuff, and get out, and that puts them in a drastically different category than all the other shooters on the market. The main thing to note here is that get shot, or alternatively get shooting other people, isn't part of that lovely little acronym that I just made up, and that's because the shooting part of this third-person shooter is entirely optional. And not in the way that my AFK Overwatch teammate thinks shooting is optional, it's straight up just not the primary way that you make progress in this world. The real progression comes from, well, getting stuff. That means breaking open lockers or cracking open crashed space pods, or yeah, occasionally shooting someone until they turn into just another container for you to empty of all its valuable little bits and bobs. However, since getting stuff is the primary objective of the game, failure means you'll lose it. And I'm not just talking about the 3 wires and bits of metal scrap you pulled out of a dead robot. Everything you bring with you is at risk. Your ammo, your shields, even your guns can be easily lost to another player, to a turret with too much range, or even to just a bad bit of platforming. And even though that does add some very welcome stakes to every engagement, it's also a massive barrier to entry. Players like getting stuff, sure, but they're practically allergic to losing it. Someone might be willing to dump hours and hours into farming the perfect god roll for a legendary in Borderlands, but that's because they'll have it forever. The potential for loss basically makes everything into a consumable. Potentially helpful, but only a limited number of times, and with how adverse players often are to loss, it's not uncommon for them to avoid consumables entirely, because using limited resources feels bad. To be clear, this isn't some weird setup section where I bring up a problem and then address how the game developers have discovered a brilliant solution. No, losing stuff does suck. I got my hands on a funny little machine gun, accidentally ran out of ammo for it, and got jumped at extract. So now I don't have that machine gun anymore, and my wall has a new hole in it. It's not bad design. Again, the potential to lose anything makes the stakes feel higher than ever, but it's undoubtedly part of why the genre has never managed to break into the mainstream consciousness. Games like Tarkov and Hunt Showdown aren't small by any means, but the genre has always been considered niche, even by its biggest supporters. Speaking personally, I hardly even knew extraction shooters were a real thing. All I'd heard were occasional whispers about how people were mad about the latest wipe, but recently, that's been changing. Over the past few years, smaller game modes or spin-offs like Call of Duty's Demilitarized Zone have been popping up more and more, and while the success of these projects has been debatable, the upcoming releases of Marathon and Arc Raiders are still posed to bring a huge influx of eyes and wallets towards the genre. The latter especially has garnered some incredibly palpable attention, the previously mentioned Server Slam granting it a 3rd place spot in the Steam top sellers list off pre-orders alone. This means more players than ever before are getting their first taste of the genre, and that's why this recent server test was so important. Both Marathon and Arc Raiders have had public tests before, but last weekend was the first time that everyone was allowed in on the fun. Tons of players got their first hands-on experience with the whole genre in this 3-day window, so even if the communicated intent was a simple test of the servers, the weight that this event carried was massive. So, how'd it do? This is actually a pretty difficult question to answer, because weeding through all the community responses is more of a challenge here than it's been for other videos I've made. Not only is most of the feedback on forums like the Arc Raiders subreddit from experienced players instead of the brand new ones I want to focus on, but the feedback itself is often harder to judge. While there is plenty of legitimate criticism to find, there are plenty of new players complaining about aspects of the genre as opposed to aspects of the game. The biggest example is probably the enemy design. One of the most prevalent pieces of feedback from the community at large is to nerf the non-player enemies. Tons of people, from famous streamers to BotHater69 on Twitter, think the Terminator robots are terminating a bit too well, and I can understand why. They do large amounts of damage incredibly quickly, take a seemingly infinite amount of bullets without slowing down, and can be really hard to run away from once they've seen you. Players trying to engage with the PvP mechanics would regularly lose, not because of their opponents, but because some drone got attracted by all the gunfire and shot them in the back. And while skills like positioning and awareness are a part of preventing that, it seemed like these third-party incidents were happening more often than people wanted. The problem is that even with the sheer number of people expressing this opinion, it's not clear if any of the criticism actually holds any water. The server slam was limited to early game guns, and most people were stuck running the default weapons for their whole experience, so it's natural that the enemies wouldn't fall easily to the weakest options available. That, as well as people's general unfamiliarity with a brand new game, has probably led to this issue being overinflated, but even if that's not true, it might just be a genre thing. The enemies here aren't always supposed to be beaten, especially by someone running solo. Sure, they can be beaten, given the right amounts of knowledge and preparation and ability to aim a gun better than me, but if these enemies are balanced around giving a party of 3 a hard time, yeah, a solo player's gonna have some trouble. Even as a full trio, unless you're specifically going for the loot that these guys drop, combat is kind of a failure state. After all, guns are loud, and announcing to everybody in a gunshot sound wide radius that you're currently lower on both ammo and health than you were before isn't always the brightest decision. And finally, it's kinda just the dynamic of the genre to have difficult enemies that can kick your butt. Fighting is supposed to be a risk, not just because of the enemy themselves, but because of how it affects your interactions with other players. On one hand, people with ill intentions want to wait for you to be engaged in combat to make their move, but that advantage is only meaningful if the AI enemy is a sufficient threat. At the same time, having difficult enemies encourages players to team up, or at least call a temporary truce to deal with something that poses a threat to both of them, lest they both end up downed long before extract. This genre facilitates both kinds of interactions, but the complexity and meaning of either type would falter without a powerful third party, so the bots should probably stay the terrifying threat that they currently are. The point I'm trying to make is that feedback like this isn't really a criticism of the game at all, it's a criticism of the genre, and people who don't like those aspects were never going to appreciate that part of the experience that extraction shooters aim to create. The same goes for the people complaining about losing their guns when they die, or the other players with better loot ambushing them and taking their stuff. These criticisms are directed at ARC Raiders, sure, but they're the result of a conflict with the genre, not the individual game itself. I know games don't have to follow the blueprint of their given genre to a T. Some of the best games garner so much praise because of the trends that they buck, instead of the ones that they follow. But there are some aspects that are core to the extraction shooter experience that are going to cause conflicts with what many players want out of their games. Realistically, there wasn't anything ARC Raiders could have done in this server slam to please that part of the audience, short of changing their entire genre for a second time. However, it did have plenty of control over the impression it left on the new players who were intrigued by the core aspects instead of turned away. The people who were dipping their toes into the experience for the first time with this 3-day trial period and using it to determine if they'll pay the $40 entry fee to experience the full thing. Unfortunately though, when it comes to those people, I think the server test wasn't as perfect as it could have been. Now don't get me wrong, it did really well in a bunch of areas. The visual presentation is solid, the world building is communicated quickly and efficiently, and most of the key parts of the experience are clearly present and functioning, even in this quick little server test. As someone having their second ever extraction shooter experience, I got a real feel for the combat and the stealth and the interactions I could have with other players. I learned how it felt to die seconds away from extract, I experienced obstacles I clearly wasn't prepared for, I found out that you could ask people for directions, and sometimes I'd even get answers in the form of words instead of bullets. I had a solid time for the full 14 hours I was able to dump into the test, and the experience almost completely sold me on the game. Almost. See, there is one reason that I haven't jumped on the ARC Raiders pre-order train yet, despite my experience, and that's because a key aspect was missing from the server slam. And when I say key, I mean key, like one of the 3 G's key. I'm saying that the entire looting aspect of the game, the process of getting stuff that I emphasized so heavily earlier, was basically missing entirely from the slam. And, well, that's a pretty important part of making the whole do I like this enough to drop $40 on it decision. Now, I do need to explain myself really quick, because there definitely was loot in the free slice of game that we got. It's not like they emptied every bot of their bolts and every abandoned locker of their wine bottles and playing cards. All of the stuff is still there, but at the same time, it is all just stuff. Every item has a purpose, but for whatever reason, the devs limited the server tests in a way that left those purposes redundant. See, the progression in this game is largely based around crafting. You come back from a mission with pockets full of wires and scrap metal and head right to the workbench to fashion them into something useful. It could be shields to block damage, guns to deal damage, or zip lines to fly away from damage as fast as possible, but the point is, you're encouraged to make this stuff yourself instead of actually finding it out in the wild. Unlike my experience with Marathon, it was incredibly rare for me to find guns or even ammo in the middle of a run. My loadout was almost always made of stuff that I had made, and the loot that got me excited consisted of extra rare bits of scrap or the occasional blueprint that didn't even do anything until I brought it back to the workbench. Or, well, that's the loot that was supposed to get me excited, but it never actually gave me that feeling in my full 14 hours, because that loot was literally worthless. Okay, it technically wasn't worthless. I did manage to sell a blueprint for a nice 5,000 coins, but as far as its purpose as a blueprint goes, it was basically non-existent. If you played the server slam, you already know what I'm getting at here, but if you didn't, you need to understand that this icon was the bane of every player the entire weekend. I get why Embark Studios didn't want to put the full version of their game out for free 2 weeks before they sold it for $40, and for the most part, I think they handled it well. It sucks to be limited to one map, especially when the tech test that got everyone excited had 3, but I get that some surprises are best left for the actual game. What I don't think should have been left out, though, was the majority of the progression system. Of the 7 crafting stations we know will be in the game, 3 of them were completely unavailable in the Server Slam, and the remaining 4 were limited to level 1. This limited your crafting options to common and occasionally uncommon gear, and when your entire progression system is based on crafting, that's going to cause some problems. Not only was it relatively easy to get a surplus of the most common resources in the game, but players didn't even need them. After all, the shops sell plenty of these lower rarity items, and cash never became too much of an obstacle when half the loot you got only existed to be sold. Rarity is supposed to be a guide as to what you're supposed to get excited about, but anything over uncommon only existed to be thrown away or recycled into the same common components your pockets were already stuffed with. This basically walled off the entire progression system, locking players down with their low-level guns and shields and preventing them from experiencing that entire aspect of the game. And I know that this section might come off as unreasonable. I'm asking for more free access to a paid game when I was never entitled to any access in the first place, but it's important to remember the context in which this server test was being viewed. This was the first hands-on exposure to an entire genre of game for many players, so the experiences they had are going to be formative for their opinions on the genre as a whole going forward, and I can't help but feel that those opinions are going to be negatively influenced by the missing system. In case I wasn't clear about how much this matters, the loot is basically the entire motivating factor that actually gets people playing the game, and without it, players stop engaging. I never felt like killing other players because when I did, they just had the same gray rarity gear on them that I had. I never wanted to take risks to fight bigger enemies because I wouldn't be able to use their drops for anything I couldn't already do. High danger, high loot value areas had the same value as low danger, low value ones because that value was non-existent. My motivation to keep playing came from the novelty of the new experience and the limited nature of the test, but never from the systems that were created to encourage it because those systems weren't present. By the end, I was already feeling done with the experience, and I'm not even sure I would have done my last few runs if I didn't need footage for this video, and I don't think that's a good first impression to leave the massive audience of new players with. The point of the Server Slam was to test the servers, but it was also to give players a taste of why they would want to play the game, why they'd risk jumping into a genre that has historically turned away so many players. So removing the why from this test is going to stop a number of those people from diving into a genre they were probably already pretty cautious of. I'm honestly less likely to grab the game now. The novelty has worn off a bit, and I've been thinking that if the game ends up feeling like those last few runs I did, where the tension was gone because nothing I did meant anything, it simply won't be worth my time. This is an inherently unfair opinion for me to have. I know the game has progression, I know it has loot, and I've been told that the loot matters. It's not a matter of the content being missing, we know it's there, the people in the technical tests even got to experience it, but I didn't. I played a different version of the game, one that I felt had problems, and it's hard to overwrite that feeling, because, well, it's my first impression. I'm throwing a lot of first-person pronouns out here, so just to make something clear, I do think that I will buy this game. Probably. In preparation for this video, I've read a bunch of stuff about this game's progression, from people who had the same problems in the Server Slam to posts about loot feeling underwhelming even back in the technical tests. But overall, it seems like a system that'll work for me. I've seen people falling to pieces when they lose materials they'd been searching for hours for, and I've heard about people getting really excited over finding a dog collar for what I hope are wholesome reasons. Honestly, my time with Marathon has proven to me the value and associated tension that can come from finding a particularly important bit of loot, but I don't think most people have all of that. If someone new to the genre had their first experience over that one weekend, they'll probably go from wondering what all their stuff does to realizing it does nothing and losing interest as a result. I can't speak for people who aren't me, and realistically, the best thing I could do here is pull up a bunch of Reddit posts with people complaining about the things I've voiced here, but it's not really those people I'm concerned about. If someone's invested enough in the game to make a Reddit post, they're already above the interaction level of the average player. They're clearly motivated to get their opinion out there, and are hopefully interested in the response and details around that opinion. But for every person making a post, there are hundreds of people silently playing the game and having experiences that they'll just take as the way things are. Reading this out, it almost sounds like an insult, like I'm saying they're not intelligent or informed enough to make the right decision. But what was the free trial they dumped hours into for, if not to form their own decision on if they enjoyed the experience or not? People don't always make perfect rational decisions, especially when it comes to what we do for fun. And honestly, if your first impression is that something doesn't work for you, spending more time and money on it in an attempt to prove yourself wrong sounds far more irrational. It's just a shame that those impressions could have been different. This video is pretty dumb, conceptually. I mean, I'm basically writing a review of a version of a game that only existed for 3 days and complaining about things that are probably never going to be problems for people playing the full release, but I still think these ideas are interesting and important. I doubt we'll actually see any measurable consequences for anything I've talked about here. It's not like I can survey every single person who doesn't buy the game and ask them why, and with the amount of hype being built up around this title, I'm feeling confident that it'll do well regardless of any minor mistakes in a 3-day server test. However, every time I see someone who says that this niche genre just isn't for them, I'll always wonder if they decided that after playing this test, or some other incomplete entry in the genre, and if they could have become a fan if their first impression actually showed all that it had to offer. But who knows? The game isn't even out yet. Maybe it'll release and everyone will be talking about how the crafting progression and loot is broken and underwhelming, and you can all run back to this video and praise me as a prophet. Obviously, I hope that doesn't happen. This game has the chance to do something great, and I truly hope they stick the landing. But that's all for me for now. I'm happy you decided to spend your lunch break listening to what I had to say, and if you could drop a like or subscribe on your way out the door, it would be incredibly appreciated as always. Go have some fun out there. See ya.